Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's AZBioPEERS discussion on public policy for the Health Innovation Founder. And as we know, public policy decisions, they have a real impact on how life science companies are funded, regulated, and ultimately able to bring new innovations to the patient. So for today, we're lucky to be joined by Steve Potts, Tom Eisiminger, and our host, Joan Koerber-Walker. And I'll let our discussion begin by some introductions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan, and thank you for all your hard work in putting these AZBioPEERS programs together. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this edition of AZBioPEERS, where we're talking about public policy and how it impacts our life science sector and, more importantly, our life science companies and their employees. So as we get started, I'm going to ask our panelists to do a quick introduction. And Tom, do you want to kick us off?
I'll be glad to, Joan. Hi, I'm Tom Eisiminger. I'm the president and CEO of Regenesis Medical, an early stage growth company in Scottsdale, focused on chronic pain, particularly pain associated with diabetic neuropathy, with a device that's non-implantable and non-invasive. And I'll point out that this is actually my second career. I'm a retired Army officer, spent a little over 20 years in the military, and now I've spent 21 years in the life science industry.
Awesome. Terrific. And Steve.
Hey guys, great to talk to you again. Thanks for joining. I've been in Arizona 18 years, CEO of a company. We've raised 82 million called Breakthru Medicines. We're developing drugs for solid tumors, be in the clinic early next year. Exciting times. And I've been here in post PhD in cancer for about first half of my career in diagnostics, and then the second half in therapeutics.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's great to have leaders from both our medical device and our drug development sector with us to talk about things that are the same and things that might be a little different. So, when we talk about public policy, right, as CEOs, we wear a lot of hats. When did you first realize that public policy is actually part of your job description? Steve?
I had no choice. I was raising for a small, I really had not touched public policy, did not do it in diagnostics, even though I was, at Quest, which was a Fortune 500 company, and really didn't do it very much early in my career in drug development. And I hit the IRA pill penalty lawnmower in 2022 and really just had a hard time fundraising and was realizing that. And then it was actually psychologically reassuring that it wasn't just me having issues fundraising. It was a kind of a class issue on that small molecule penalty. So got involved, talked to people, and then it kind of sort of sucked me in just on that one topic. And I've kind of stayed on that one topic really up until the last year, just focused on one issue that kind of directly personally affected me trying to raise money for small molecule companies.
Awesome. Tom, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I always realized it. And I sort of teed this up by saying I'm a retired Army officer. There's a big strategist called Clausewitz in the military that focused on the Trinity, which is military, the people, and the government. And you've got to attack all three of those if you're going to win a conflict. I'm going to change that now to the med device industry. I think it's the three Ps. It's patients, providers, and payers. And when you're dealing with payers, you better be talking about the fourth P, which is policy.
Because, the reality is we operate in the life sciences and in health in probably one of the most heavily regulated industries, where many industries are regulated relative to their safety and efficacy, right, which we are too, of course. But very few also have such extensive regulations on how our products get paid for and how our products reach patients. And so policy takes on a whole new factor as we move from discovery to development to delivery. And it's not until delivery that we're actually impacting patients' lives. And so it's critically important that we work with our public policy people at every stage. And, it's interesting. My very first CEO job was in the early 2000s. And at that time, we were working on getting the SBIR programs reauthorized. And I, was up on the Hill and visiting and talking to our elected leaders and learning about policy. And that's something that's never stopped. So it is critically important that we all understand how to work with the people that we elect to represent us and that they appoint to execute on the laws or the policies that they put in place. Steve, you talked a little bit about the pill penalty and how that impacted your desire to get involved. And when you're thinking about as a CEO, you're developing the strategy. How do public policy decisions show up in your strategic plan?
It's really fun having Tom on here, and it's also fun having you on here, Joan, with you unquestionably a superpower in policy. So, but I like the contrast between Tom coming from med device and also coming from having served in the military, because like when I go out and fundraise in a biotech, you never hear questions on policy, pricing, reimbursement. What's your reimbursement strategy? Never comes up. We talk about 100, a certain amount per patient, and we argue about how many cancer patients because it's a different and that's a downside because honestly in cancer we stopped talking about that and I don't have the kind of personnel on my team that a large pharma does, every possible policy topic there's somebody whose job it is to do that. It's not the CEOs, but it actually blinds us because we just think that if I have a drug and it's good and I show clinical data, it's going to get reimbursed at a certain amount. And there's, as long as I'm sure that there's this many patients and I'm thinking about this versus the other drugs those patients are taking, you have a real opportunity, I think, if you can think a little bit broader. But I would say, if I was talking to myself from 3 years ago and I said, look, I got a new company going, how should policy play a role in the messaging on my website? And, do I want to spend any time on this at all? All the other things I would do. I think it's powerful if you can think of just one policy issue that is closest to your mission, and closest to kind of to authentically who you are. Like when Tom gets up and talks about anything with our veterans, he's so authentic. I mean, I just want to not even be on the panel and just listen to him because it's just he's authentic. I mean, he's lived it, he's been in the military, he speaks so well about that. And then when he ties it to Regenesis, it's even better. And it doesn't feel artificial. And so, when I talk about if I'm doing a small molecule drug and I talk about how I need to have a certain amount of time at the end of life of the patent and also at the beginning to really pay back that drug, it's authentic when I talk about, having lived issues with fundraising on a pill pendulum. So I would say, I think that there is a room, and I think that take home for the audience is to think about one policy issue that is most tied to your mission that really could be super authentic, both in what you've lived and also potentially is tied to, your drug development. Obviously, your vaccine, biotech, that's going to be your topic. But other things you have to kind of think about. But I think there is a room for it. And I also like it because it forces you to speak as a CEO directly to the American living room. This is what we do so well with the Arizona Bio Week coming up. That Friday on patients is awesome. You speak to that group. You're talking to normal people about what we do, and it just makes you better fundraising too, because when you start to bring that message in and then add a technical level to it, it just makes people just want to listen and they want to think about it and they want to kind of help your mission. So I do think it's got some real value, but it isn't something you can just start tomorrow and be good at. It took me probably 3 years to not be horrible at speaking about public policy.
Thanks, Steve and Tom. Steve has been very, very laser focused on, a particular policy that he has become expert on. You and I both sit on boards at the national level for our industry. So we do have to be more fluent on a wide range of issues. But if you were to think of the one issue that most impacts Regenesis, what is it?
Oh, that's pretty easy for me. I would say is linking the regulatory pathway with the reimbursement pathway. And there's a new program called Rapids out now that's fairly, it just was announced and it's trying to do that. And the problem is it's so unpredictable on how long the process is going to take from getting through FDA to then getting through Medicare and CMS. And that stifles investment. You know, if an investor doesn't know how long's the timeline, when am I going to get my return? That's a real challenge for raising capital. So I would say that's the biggest thing is if somehow you can link the regulatory pathway to the reimbursement pathway to shorten that timeline, which then gives innovators and entrepreneurs access to capital. But I mean, there's other policy things that have an impact, like Arizona State has the research and development incentive where you can get up to $100,000 to offset some of the R&D work you've done. That's an important policy decision. That's non-dilutive funding for a startup company.
So, Steve, thinking about, how we move forward. How do you approach those conversations when we talk about innovation versus access and affordability? I mean, we have a big budget problem in healthcare. So
Yeah, you have to be very, for example, let's think about patent protection. And, this comes in a lot of different ways, whether it's IRA legislation on pricing and negotiation earlier, or there's been, all kinds of flavors that things that really basically erode that protection on patents. You have to really first understand what we're trying to do with really patent protection, having that time for the innovator to be out in front and get that investment back so that, the R&D is getting invested. And so, you have to understand that piece, but you also have to really be serious about the trade-offs. Like I am increasingly more vocal about, if a biologic stays at a high price much longer than its patent life, that is competing fund that doesn't go into new innovative drugs. And that's not something normally that you would talk about because it's a tricky one, but you have to be, I think, very cognizant of we are in an environment where we do need to think about how do we have the right amount of dollars going to the right things. And so whereas 5 years ago I probably wouldn't have been thinking about a biologic going far much longer than it should in terms of high pricing and not having the competition from biosimilars to bring it down. Now I think about that. I mean, I'm actually there's a certain amount of money that goes to oncology, and if it's all going to drugs biologics that are 25 years on the market at still a high price, that is money that is not going to go to some new novel innovation, that where it should be. So I think you got to think a little bit holistically about it. But that's a lot to chew off when you're just getting into what is my message around policy. So, again, I think you have to think about what your mission is and then think about what policy topic is the most directly relevant to something you're trying to do. Like Tom said, I mean, obviously, again, devices, I think you start with reimbursement before you even talk about the tech, and so that's true there. For me, it still is IRA, it's still MFN. Those things do directly tie to, things we're trying to do in terms of having investors know that the political environment will be stable, when we're on the market and getting reimbursed for the drug.
So, Tom, obviously, Rapid is directly related to the reimbursement discussion. How important when we're talking about that innovation versus accessibility and affordability, how important is the part of the discussion where we're talking about these new innovative medical devices are keeping people out of the hospital, are reducing costs, are
Right.
helping to bend the healthcare cost curve?
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges with policy is policymakers change. They change a lot. So you really have to sort of look at the strategic environment down the road. And I'll give you the biggest thing that I'm focused on. In 7 years, Social Security is bankrupt. Medicare Trust Fund is bankrupt. Um, the next the next 4 to 6 years, Congress has some really challenging discussions on Social Security and Medicare, and how are we going to fund all of this? Let's face it, my mother didn't work. There were 4 kids in my family. Today, you have both parents working, and you have an average of 1.56 kids per family. There's not enough people growing into the workforce to pay for us older people like me, and I'll be at Medicare eligible next year. There's just not enough to pay for. So we have to have innovative products that are deflationary, not inflationary to the healthcare system. Part of that's got to be, and one of the things we're focused on is we're a home health device. You can treat at home. Cheapest point of care is at the home. I'll give you some other things that I think are coming. Value-based payments. So I'm willing to say with my device, look, and I've got to approach Medicare, the Center for Medicare Innovation, to talk to them about, because this is a unique payment model. You know what? If it doesn't work, just pay me for the shipping and handling for the device back and forth. But if it does work and it avoids a inflationary procedure, then pay me a premium. But we got to be willing to have those discussions to create value to the healthcare system, because the fact is it's bankrupt in 7 years, and we've got to change the way we do business. And we have to create that pipeline to get these innovative products that are deflationary to market.
Yep. And, when we
I
talk
think that's
about,
something where
go ahead, Steve.
I think that's something where the devices, when you have a smaller company, you think more holistically about, I'm putting this device on, and then what is the total cost? What is the alternatives, the hospital costs, the out of work costs? I think you do probably on average do a better job than we do in biotech, where we have a longer cycle. And typically, again, we, often think, well, I'm just going to put this in the hands of large pharma. They're going to worry about all of that. But I think I echo Tom that, like, increasingly, for example, let's take a bladder cancer drug. So that is an incredibly expensive disease. You get your bladder taken out, you then have to live without a bladder. It could easily be $500,000 with not about drug costs, but about everything else about the life, the poor life you have, and just the incredible costs with that whole process. And so you think about that, and then you think about, what is my drug doing to offset those costs, versus my drug, it has this response rate. How does it compare to the other, drugs that have that response rate? It's very different when you're thinking about, more broadly about what will this do for the patient. And we don't realize how much the biomedical industries get pigeonholed into cost reduction of healthcare in the United States. Let's focus on devices and drugs. I mean, we're 9% of the U.S. budget for drugs, percent or two probably on devices. It's 30% hospital costs. It's 20% for the doctor's offices. But you don't see that, because in every state, the number one employer in every state is typically a hospital system. So we are small companies that have small footprints in terms of employees, but you have to go into it really being very aware of where the healthcare dollars are going for the disease you're going after, and then be very serious about, if my device or drug is successful, am I really gonna hack away at that? Colon cancer, these are younger people getting this. I mean, it's very different getting colon cancer at age 40 than it is at age 70 in terms of what the cost is to the system, the cost of that person not being able to work, et cetera, et cetera. So, these are things that, and again, the more broadly you think about it, the more frankly appealing your pitch is about why you should, invest in the device. And the more it gets to people that are thinking about funding it, that are not necessarily propeller head, cancer geeks like I am, but what does resonate is, the overall experience of that patient and all the other costs that are incurred that this device or drug may help address.
Thanks. So, Tom, when you are having those conversations, because as you said, we have a problem, and elected leaders also have a problem, which is if you start cutting benefits to the people that elect you, they're not going to elect you again. So it's kind of, as they say in military, a catch-22. When you have those conversations, right, it really has to be built on having a productive relationship with policymakers, right? You don't go knocking on somebody's door that you've never met, that you've never talked to ask them for a big favor. So how do you, over time, build those relationships, Tom?
Well, I think part of it is, well, number one, being a member of AZBio helps because there's engagement with policymakers from the get-go. I also am a member of AdvaMed, which is the Medical Device Manufacturers Association in Washington, D.C. And I think the point is, if you're not engaging with policy people now, even if you're an early stage company, it's too late when you show up with a problem. You don't want to show up to them with a problem. You need to be out there talking to them and educating them, and be willing to talk to them about with data and some evidence. And you need to be willing to listen to their concerns because, as you pointed out, they've got a constituency to answer to as well. So I think the big thing is being out there talking to policymakers, educating them, because in the end, they're the decision maker. And so you have to educate them so they can take all the equities that are out there, their constituents, public policy, how are we going to get through this cliff that's coming in 7 years? But again, if you're waiting until there's a problem and you've been denied payment by Medicare, it's too late. You need to be talking to them now.
So, Steve, I know you've worked really hard to build relationships across this policy ecosystem. How did you do it?
I think first, that's a good question. I mean, first is staying authentic, and staying in my lane. There was a joke in politics about, I think, Brad Pitt during one of the elections. Someone asked him, "Hey, what do you think about this candidate, that fan?" He's like, "Why the hell are you asking me? I'm an actor." And I think there's a tendency to think like, oh, because I'm being asked about policy, I need to know everything. I don't. I need to know what I know. And then from there, from my experience, just as everyone relates to their experience. So starting with that, and then looking for people that like you really respect that do seem to know what I don't know. And so I early on kind of leaned on some people that I thought kind of like my consigliaries. Joan, you were one of those on policy. No Patient Left Behind was another. They've been fantastic, and doing a lot actually with helping CEOs, coaching CEOs to speak well on policy topics that they're interested in. So there was a few, that was helpful. And then just kind of staying curious, but not going in with like, I need to have answers to this. And I think it's interesting too, like you being very aware of where would I add value by publicly speaking about something, and where would I add more value by just having the private discussion saying, look, like you don't see me talking about MFN. There's other people that talk about most favored nation, trying to peg price of the drug in the US with the price of every single other country. It's a very incredibly heavy-handed, government driven. I mean, it just is a catastrophic kind of approach. But you don't see me talking about that because I'm not going to add a lot of value, publicly speaking. Other people can do that, but privately, I'll have discussions. But I think just being aware of when I can add some value with some, a few times now and then in public forums, and then often in just, private conversations, and also just saying, person you really want to talk to is so and so. They're the expert there. But if there's a couple policy areas that I know, I can talk to you about. So I think just going slowly at it, being careful. I mean, just like you would, like, in your disease area, like Tom, I'm sure you get outside of that disease, you're not going to talk about pontificate on some disease topic you guys are working on. I'm not going to talk about diabetes or neuroscience, but on cancer, I've got 25 years of working against cancer, and I know something, and I can speak pretty deeply about that. So, stay in my lane on disease, and you just again, if you just know that you can do this incrementally and kind of stay in your lane on one maybe two policy topics, it gives you confidence that you don't have to, kind of get deer in the headlights of like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to say about, some MFN policy? I don't even know what the latest thing is on it. So, yeah, I mean, it's incremental. It's just being thoughtful about who you talk to and who kind of you use as advisors in policy, and then being very thoughtful about what you want to say, but what's a public, stance and what is more private discussions with legislators.
So, Tom, you've been building relationships for decades. I want to slant this question a little bit differently for you. If you were talking to a young CEO or a new CEO that you were mentoring, and I know you do that a lot, how would you help them think about building those relationships that will serve them for their CEO career?
Well, number one, I'd tell them to join the professional organizations. I know this sounds like a pitch for AZBio, and it is. But they should join the professional organization to be around like-minded individuals that are focused on building a healthcare an ecosystem that encourages investment, that encourages bringing talent in that we can use in our organizations. I would reach out to your local university and see if you can do partnerships with them. There's internships that are fantastic. That's part of building relationships within the ecosystem. I would encourage them to reach out to their local congressman or woman and just say, hey, I just want to come introduce myself. I am one of your constituent companies. And I think it's important that you know who we are and what we're doing. And I'd love to answer any questions you might have. And when you go visit with those folks, tell them some policy things that they've done that have really helped your company or the organization or the ecosystem. People love to help. They love to help, but you got to tell them that it's making a difference. So I would encourage them to do those things. Reach out to your university, reach out to the professional organizations, and third, reach out to your local elected officials. And that same applies at the state level.
I mean, we're going to pivot to the state level in a minute, but before we do, I want to talk just quickly and share my experience in building those relationships too. So, number one, for those of you that have the opportunity and take advantage of going to Capitol Hill and meeting with the offices, you will spend a lot more time with legislative staff than you will spend with your elected member. So the staff members are critically important. Yes. Making sure that they have the information they need to support their elected leader is a lot more important than the photo op outside the door of the office. And so building those relationships, being a trusted resource, reaching out to them by email. Once you've met them, they'll give you your card and you'll know how to reach them. Reaching out to them when something happens that they might need to know about, that is the way you build the relationship. And
the important thing you're going to hear on this call is, I mean, 1000%, Joan, you taught me that, and I mean, I'm using that in Capitol Hill, in private discussions every day now. You can't emphasize that enough. It's the staffers that matter.
Exactly.
When you go for a visit on Capitol Hill, you might get 5 minutes with your elected leader. You might get 15 to 20 minutes or longer sometimes with staff. Those relationships will plug you into other discussions and relationships with commissions and agencies and lots of other places.
Exactly.
But if you have a problem, you're not going to go to your elected leader, you're going to go to the staff.
Good point.
So it's really, really important to build that relationship with staff. So next I want to do that pivot, all right, because there's a lot of stuff happening at the federal level. And yes, it impacts us at the discovery level, it impacts us at the development level where these two companies are. It impacts us when we go to deliver and impact the lives of patients. There are some things where the policy is set at the federal level. There are other things where the policy is set at the state level. What many people don't think about is that in our Constitution, the responsibility for enforcement of different policies is state law, state enforcement. That's why, for instance, we have an insurance commission in every state. If it is a state governed insurance plan, every state is different. That's why we've had issues with portability and things like that. But it actually goes back to our Constitution. So when we start thinking about policy, it's not just the policy at the federal level, although things like NIH funding and tariffs and USPTO and BIDOL and all of those federal programs do have a huge impact, FDA. But when it comes down from 30,000 feet to ground level, it's happening in the states. And very often, policy happens in the state before it happens at the federal level. So with the federal level, they have so many things they have to cover. And a bill has a 2-year potential lifespan of a Congress. So every time they start a new Congress, the bills start over. And you may take something that's been progressing from one Congress and reintroduce it in the next Congress, but there's no guarantee. Now, when we get down to the state level, to the state house, our legislature tends to get things done a lot faster. And that's the same in other state legislatures around the country. A good example of where we've seen state policy become federal policy is right to try. Right to try originated in Arizona. It, migrated from state to state to state. When it got to critical mass, an Arizona legislative team of several of our elected leaders, really pushed the way in building consensus with their fellow elected leaders. And then right to try became law at the federal level. But it was happening in the states well before it was happening at the federal level. And so those are examples of how something originates in states and moves to federal. So it's not always federal pushing down on our companies from that level. We get it from both sides. So let's talk about what we're seeing at an Arizona level. What are the things that make the greatest difference in driving support for our health innovation companies? And Tom, I'm going to ask you to kick off.
Yeah, I think there are several things. One is I think this big boost to the whole ecosystem with this $50 billion coming from Taiwan Semiconductor is going to lift everybody. It's going to increase the tax base, which gives more opportunity for the legislature to do things like create an innovation trust fund, which would be something that from a policy standpoint I would go for, because that lifts the smaller companies up when there's access to capital for innovations. I think continuing with the R&D tax credit would be important because that does encourage research and development with non-dilutive funding. There are a lot of policy things that could help. Just things that are going to bring the talent to Arizona. Those types of policies, because we need engineers. We need scientists. I mean, we've got some great universities here, but we need more and more with AI. We need more and more IT professionals. So I think all of those policy decisions that increase the talent base, that encourage research, that encourage access to capital, I think all of those things are very important to the ecosystem.
Thank you. Steve, when you're at the state capitol, right, what are some of the policies that you see that are important to fostering health innovation in Arizona?
I think anything that causes, people like Tom and I to want to live here and build companies here, and then makes it easier to recruit, top scientists to come here with their families. And, I've done this. I mean, I had 28-person team before, recruited a lot of people here. And the first question often, is, well, what are the schools like for?
Oops.
Oops.
Looks like we had a little tough technical difficulty there. I'm sure that Steve will be back. So, when we look at the state level, right, there's so many things that impact our families, right? Impact our healthcare system, impact our patients. So, from AZBio's perspective, and Tom and Steve are both on the AZBio board, so they know this. From AZBio's perspective, we actually look through public policy through a 3-phase lens. The first thing is, does this policy help patients? Because patients are why we exist as an industry, right? It is providing that help to people when they need it. And so the first lens that we look at for public policy is it good for patients? The second lens we look through is it good for Arizona? Right? Tom mentioned, building our ecosystem, building our economy, building our tax base so we have more money for schools and roads and all those other things that you don't necessarily think are connected to us, but really are. The healthcare and life sciences sector is one of the largest economic engines in the state of Arizona. And while the semiconductor boom is having a major impact right now through direct foreign investment to build buildings, the actual economic impact of that production from that industry is a fraction of ours.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times we have to continue to remind our elected leaders of facts and numbers, because it's really easy to chase the shiny penny, if you can find a penny anymore. And I see that Dr. Potts is back, so hold on, I am going to add him back in.
So I'll highlight my point. What matters is infrastructure, right? Just like losing connection and coming back on. If you don't have infrastructure for biotech, you're dead, and that's people. Are you in a place where you want to build, people want to come naturally, organically? You're not enticing them here. They want to come here. And so what is that? It's public schools, it's public universities. I mean, I'm a huge fan of, both of my kids went to public high schools here, and huge fan of that. Policies that do that. Things like our airport is so easy to get in and out of. The PBC building is, 10 minutes from the airport. It's pretty much, it has to be one of the easiest cities for running a biotech and have people fly in internationally. Having that airport now with direct flights to Taipei, what an incredible advantage. I used to, like 8 years ago, I ran a global trial. Part of it, I didn't run it, but I was doing the Med Affairs piece of it. And we were in 16 countries. And so to fly to Taiwan, I had to fly Sunday morning to Dallas, and then fly over my house in the afternoon to go to Taiwan. I mean, psychologically, it was a nightmare, and it was just so much extra time. Now these direct flights, I mean, what an incredible opportunity for Taiwanese trials. I mean, I can't wait till I be able to do that with those direct flights. That's again like what Tom said with the investment that Taiwan's made here, that we can build off of. So, it's built. It's the ecosystem message is what I talk to about policymakers, and it's absolutely education, but it's also keeping this a pro science state. And so it is kind of understanding where there's a real, there is there's people that have very strong views on the COVID vaccine and how it was rolled out, how it was affected them personally, but not letting that trickle into all of the other awesome vaccines we have and all the amazing things that vaccines have done, being able to, keep this as a pro-science state with, and so fighting some things that might be very damaging that people are like, I don't think I want to live in a state where you have it's that much of an aversion to modern science and, listening to kind of fringe anti-science messaging. So, those are things both building a really good infrastructure here as well as protecting from, things that frankly are just not going in the direction of modern science.
Tom, do you want to add to that?
No, I think he covered it, and we've talked about that. It's don't focus on your company alone, but focus on the ecosystem when you're having discussions with policymakers and the impacts outside of the healthcare system. As it grows, you're going to build more hospitals, you're going to build more hotels, you're going to have more restaurants, you're going to have more employees. It just lifts everybody up.
Thank you. And, as we, look ahead, right? And this is a really hard question because, we could talk about this all day. But beyond the importance of, fact-based science and fact-based medical decision making, which, is a hot topic right now. Tom, what policy trends, should our companies really be if they're going to pick, one or two to learn, what should
Right.
they focus on?
Well, I mean, I would start with AI because everybody's starting to move that way. And the policymakers are going to have to make some decisions because patients want their data protected. And that's going to be a big discussion down the road because, I mean, AI changes every week. So I think AI is one. The value-based care that I talked about earlier is another one. Is there going to be a process where you get paid for outcomes? And I think that's going to be a discussion that does come down the road.
Thanks.
So I would think those two things are the big things. And I mentioned earlier, we got a cliff with Medicare, and it's going to be a Medicaid issue too. So there's going to be a lot of discussions down that road. And as you mentioned earlier, Joan, these policymakers have other constituents to answer to. And if I'm going to cut something, then maybe I'm going to not have my job in the next election. So there's a lot of things that our policymakers need to think about when they're coming up with policy.
One of the things, especially at the federal level, that's important to understand is entitlement spending versus discretionary spending. And, my parents, every time I said entitlement, they are from the greatest generation, and they would say, wait a minute. We paid for those. That is not a handout. That's not an entitlement. When we talk about entitlements at the policy level, it's because you are entitled to it because the law says you're entitled to it. And in the case of Medicare and Social Security, you paid for it. And so that's when we talk about entitlements versus discretionary. Because our population is aging, and quite frankly, it's our industry's fault. Okay. We're providing the technologies that are helping people to live longer, better lives. And so as they live longer, we spend more. And so then on top of that, We have, as Tom mentioned earlier, less people paying into those systems now. And that's a factor of the fact that Gen X is reaching its peak spending years, and they are going to be, paying for the baby boomers for the most part. So as we look at that, we have to figure out how that goes, because the entitlements get paid first. The next part of the budget at the federal level is discretionary spending. So let's talk about what's in discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is the military. Discretionary spending is education. Discretionary spending is federal infrastructure and safety programs, and all of the things that at the national level we rely on. That spending is discretionary. Now, we've seen our national debt double in less than a decade.
Mm-hmm.
We now have $40 trillion in debt. Now, some of that, just before, it breaks down into different categories, right? Some of it is foreign held, and a lot of that is actually for transactions, because the US dollar is what many currencies are pegged to. So a lot of foreign countries hold US dollars and US bonds and treasuries. It also, there was a time when China was one of the largest debt holders for the United States. That has been reduced significantly. That wasn't our strategy, that was theirs. And so the interest on the debt and the cost of healthcare are the must-pay-fors that pretty soon will exceed our ability based on the inputs into government, right? The taxes we pay, or the taxes they collect. There won't be any discretionary money left unless they continue to inflate the debt. And so, because our industry is one of those largest entitlement sectors, we have a responsibility to try and innovate to reduce cost, because quite frankly, you can't cut your way out of this problem.
Right.
And so if we have technologies that can significantly reduce the federal government's cancer spend, because end-of-life cancer care is extremely expensive. If we can reduce the impact of obesity and metabolic disease and all of the side effects and symptoms and consequences that come after that, with a medical device that is a fraction of the cost, we have to educate and advocate for policies like that, because otherwise, as Desi used to say, Lucy, we have a problem.
Joan, let me speak a bit to the
Or
cost
Steve,
side,
go
the
ahead.
things that we can control. Because, I mean, we are a lower cost state in terms of getting drugs moved along. I mean, I typically use, this surprises people. I'll say we budget $250,000 per patient for an oncology clinical trial. And that number has been increasing, not decreasing. So that's 4 patients per $1 million. So most of the cost for the drug development is in the clinical trial piece. And then it's also drugs not, failing late in trials. But that cost, half of that is the hospitals. If an MRI costs 5 times here what it does in Taiwan or Europe and Germany, then guess what? If I have to do one of those every month as part of my trial, that's 5 times more expensive. So all of those costs are built into that $250,000 per patient. The other half is the CRO cost, which has also been increasing. So we have, and I think there's some real opportunity for AI to dramatically shrink the costs on the CRO side in these clinical trials. That's under our control, whether we put up with the costs we've had or we be very innovative in how we're doing that. We're doing that at our company And I am absolutely insistent on having lower cost per patient. But you do that by doing it, not by talking about, but by doing it and then showing that, yeah, with this amount of money, I got a lot more patients on trial. And with this amount of time, we're going from idea, literally, on the other end of it, thinking about an idea to actually having a development candidate. Our current program is that's 12 months. So that's awesome. That's just because we have a lot of gray eye, a lot of experience. We use AI, but it's because there's an experienced team going quickly. So I think you can set new bars for speed and for cost effectiveness in how you do your trials. And I do think it's going to be the small private biotechs in the US that show that. And we have an opportunity in Arizona to do that. And if you have good enough people that really truly have the gray eye, the experience in their areas, you can cut costs, you can cut time without cutting quality. The other thing I think you asked, what is front and center policy? I asked Tom that. I'll answer that question too. I think in my mind, it really is the first in human regulatory path. And we had, a right to try in Arizona. We were first. Montana's taken that further along, but that's right to try with a drug that already has an IND that's already been in patients for another indication, and then you have a right to try it. So you look at a drug in colon cancer and you have a right to try it in lung cancer, but that doesn't address the what is the time and cost to get actually that first drug, the first in human experience. And that is where China has out innovated us. They're under-regulated in how they've done it, but we're over-regulated in how we've done it. So there's some things we can really learn from how the Chinese have approached their first in human. To their credit, they really studied what we were doing here and then identify that. So there's some things that we can do that I think match that don't endanger patients, but can give a faster and cleaner regulatory path. And I hope Arizona continues to be one of those test centers for that. The Barrow Neurologic Institute has their phase 0 trials that have kind of hinted at that. We've had a long history with TGen, with some of the early molecular profiling work that is kind of in that similar vein. But we have to have a much lighter weight path to trying these drugs in patients. I mean, some of these patients are in life-threatening situations, and like right now, it's a lottery in CAR T. If you can even get CAR, even if it's a really good CAR T, it's a lottery whether you can even get it. So we need to really innovate and out-innovate in the first in human piece. How do we quickly but safely with patients do put innovative therapies into the first in human trials? And there's some really good people thinking about this. This is not something you just solve on on one Zoom call. But that I think for me is a front and center thinking. And I hope that if the federal government does it, that's awesome. But in our constitutional approach, the states are incubators, they're test incubators. So I think Arizona can continue to be a place where we try some new innovative approaches. And first in human in oncology trials is one where I think it's ripe for innovation.
You want to add kind of to that, focus on innovation from the medical device perspective and some of the work that AdvaMed is doing?
Yeah, I just responded to a question that came up in chat that says, are there any programs out there that will help companies that are developing innovations that can take care of some of these big chronic diseases like diabetes that you mentioned? And there's a program called Access that CMS has that does allow medical device companies to go through that pathway. The challenge is how do you get that word out to everybody? And so that's part of the policy when we're talking to the staffers. That was a great point, Joan. The staffers will know about all these things. So if you develop a relationship with a staffer, they're going to be able to answer some of these questions and say, have you looked at the Access program? Rapid's program just came out that tries to link FDA and CMS pathway together. And then you can have discussions with them about the weaknesses or the areas for improvement that you see in those programs. So, yeah, I'd definitely make the connections and start having those conversations now.
Yeah,
Thanks,
my
Tom.
first comment to a staffer is thank you. I mean, these staffers are what makes our government go around, and they are the people you want to build a relationship with before you want to actually talk about your topic. But I thank them because I mean, in the morning they're probably talking about water issues. In the afternoon they're talking about four other issues, and then I come in and I talk about propeller heady stuff in my area. I mean, thank you for spending the time to actually think about our industry and what we need. And so but then on us is to make it like digestible what we tell them. So really be very focused in terms of, look, this is the one thing you really need to know that would be very helpful. They have a lot of policies they have to, simultaneously be experts in. And it's tough. It's a tough job.
It is. And it's also a tough job to keep us up. Let's see here. All right, I've got one more question that came in where it says we've talked about capital, infrastructure, and public policy. Um, from a founder's perspective, when we talk to state leaders, how do we start to talk to them about being able to attract and retain both talent and companies here in Arizona? What are the
I
things,
would
if
love
you were
to
going to
see,
tell people to attract a company and keep it here, what
I
would
would
you
love to
tell a
see
state policy maker?
this kind of relates to the question that came in from Jen. We have some really cool stuff happening at ASU. They have the Mark McKenna program that's doing double major biomedical and tech. It's awesome, and there's a lot of things going on, but more emphasis in our universities to make the internship process easier with our bit larger companies. I mean, it's tough. And I have a 16-person company. It's hard to pull in a lot of interns, but just a little bit of change in terms of how people are able to get experience while they're going through the university at Gore, at Bard, at BD, at any of our large medical institutions, like getting more of those, university to industry programs, so they can, the future leaders that are in universities now are getting real hands-on training in companies. Anything that moves the needle there, whether that's programs or training programs, I think would be fantastic. And there are some really good things going on. I just think we should want to do more of that.
Tom?
Yeah, one of the things I'd say, and I've used this in my veterans advocacy, where people in the state have said, how do we get more veterans to come to Arizona? And what I've said is go copy legislation that Florida and Texas have done, because they do great at keeping veterans in. So I'd say the same thing here in the life science industry is our goal is to make Arizona a top 10 state. So when we're talking to policy guys, we need to say, hey, look at what this state did. Look at some of the legislation they passed. They moved from number 25 to number 8. People love to see things that have already been tested, and then they can get behind and support. And I think that's part of the Healthcare Innovation Trust Fund that we're trying to get through, is it's been done before in other places and it's floated all the boats.
And interestingly, our big government affairs event will be in December, which is the Trailblazers Luncheon. And this year in December, we will have the new economic development numbers, and we will see not just how much higher Arizona has risen, but what's happening in the other states too. Because this is not an industry where you succeed alone, and this is not an economy that works in isolation. So when it comes to thank yous, I want to thank our panelists. We are up. Steve Potts, Tom Eisiminger, number 1, thank you for joining us today. Number 2, thank you for being leaders on the AZBio Board of Directors. And most of all, thank you for working on innovations that will make lives better for people. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week. Bye-bye.